Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Passwordless Enterprise, Why PKI is Better Than Passwords. I'm Kristen Santos, Marketing Specialist at Sectigo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Presenting with us today, we have Sectigo's CTO of PKI, Jason Soroko. Hi, Jason. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you.
And joining Jason today will be Chief Compliance Officer at Sectigo, Tim Callan. Hey, Tim. How are you doing?
Hey, Kristen. Good.
All right. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, which we expect to be around 30 to 45 minutes, allowing time for questions at the end. And you will be able to submit your questions using the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll go ahead and answer those at the end. But without further ado, Tim, go ahead and take it away.
All right. So, Jason, you and I talk about this a lot on our podcast, but we wanted to cover it here. Passwords. Passwords have a lot of problems. Perhaps, I don't know how to decide which of these is worse, but perhaps chief among them is they are very vulnerable.
Yeah, they're incredibly bad secrets, right? So essentially, if you think about it, the channel, there's a number of channels with which a password has to be, whenever you're issued with a challenge for authentication. And this is really what we're talking about here, is typically a human being authenticating into a system. It could also be a device. It could also be an automated robot. It could be RPA. It could be a number of things. But typically it's a human being who's being challenged with, hey, give me a secret and then I'll let you in. And unfortunately, a password comes under the category of a shared secret. In other words, you need to be provisioned with that secret ahead of time. That can possibly be compromised. Also, the secret needs to be known to both parties and communicated between both parties. That can be compromised. And then, of course, because human beings are human beings, we forget passwords. And additionally, sometimes we choose very poor passwords that are sometimes easy to get by our adversaries. In other words, I think what this really comes down to, Tim, is it really is a really difficult challenge. Even though it's easy to implement username password authentication schemes into your security architecture, we've seen time and time again where passwords as a shared secret are a very, very weak form of authentication.
Yeah, so we could kind of compartmentalize the problems here, right? The fact that it's a shared secret is inherently a problem. First of all, that means it's information and it can move around freely, and if it's caught, it can be, if it's captured by somebody, it can be sold, and various things happen just because it's pure information. But other problems are about the password form factor particularly, right? It's hard for people to remember passwords, right? We can all come up with uncrackable passwords, and we've seen those recommendations when we sign up for a service, but you're never going to remember that. And if you start to work on a password you can actually remember, then you have all kinds of problems. There's passwords being guessed. There's passwords being brute force cracked because they're following consistent patterns. There is credential stuffing, right? This is one of the ideas that people tend to reuse passwords. So if I find a password on one service, let's say a fairly low value service, I could maybe possibly use that same password to get into a corporate network or a bank account or something like that. They can be bought and sold. And then you've got technical problems. If your machine is owned, if there's malware, then you could be screen scraped, or there could be some kind of man in the middle. All of those things are special to the password form factor in particular, plus it's a shared secret. Now, in addition to that, they're horrible user experience. People forget them all the time. I forget mine all the time. I'm resetting them all the time. It's awful. Or you put them somewhere in a file, and then that file is vulnerable to theft. That means in a corporate environment, then they become a help desk burden. Most IT managers I talk to have a good number of tickets that are, I can't log into such and such, right? And that comes back to the fundamental usability problem of passwords and the fact that there's a dynamic between security and usability. The more you try to up the ante on security, the worse usability craters, and the more of this exasperation and frustration and help desk support you take on as a company. So passwords are awful. We all hate them. We all know that. One of the ways to help with the security aspects is MFA, but MFA has its own problems. And these are a bunch of common forms of multi-factor authentication that we've listed here. And I think we're going to briefly step through them, Jay, and I think you'll agree that you're going to see that there's a consistent set of problems that we tend to see across many or all different forms of MFA. So hard tokens are a good example. This is I own a fob. I have something on my keychain, or I have a credit card form factor in my wallet, or I have a badge that I wear that's also a token. And I take this form factor and I hit a button and I get a one-time password off it, and it's supposed to match up with whatever's going on the other side. So what are the problems with hard tokens?
Yeah, there's a number of problems, Tim, including the difficulty sometimes in just simply drop shipping those tokens to the correct people in a short amount of time. Yeah. It's all great when you have infinite time, but as soon as you have a situation such as we had earlier in 2020 with the pandemic, where a lot of new people had to work from home and be issued with authentication mechanisms, this was a problem. But I would say, Tim, just to kick off all of the OTP schemes, for example, this is something you and I have talked about in the past. Anytime a one-time password needs to be typed into your computer, an endpoint, for example, a laptop, if that laptop is compromised, that OTP is not giving you much security because of the fact that the OTP itself can be keylogged in the same way that your password has been keylogged, meaning that both halves of the multi-factor authentication, the password and the one-time password, are at the mercy of the attacker. And we have seen that successfully adopted by attackers. So I really think that sometimes it's, what might be counterintuitive to the user thinking, well, how is the bad guy going to be able to log in? I've got this multi-factor authentication method. Well, believe me, there are lots of ways that the bad guy can take advantage of the weaknesses within the system.
Yeah, if you're putting them into your computer. So, it does help against some attacks, right? If there's just a good old-fashioned credential stuff attack, or a good old-fashioned I bought your username and password on the internet attack, it will help with that. But, certainly in the world of sophisticated attackers, all these OTP schemes are not that valuable, right? Hard tokens are go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Tim. Really, just to expand on your point, absolutely for legacy systems where you'll never be able to get away from a password, sometimes legacy systems didn't, really have no ability to hook into other types of OTP or multi-factor authentication, so they're sort of hard bound to hard tokens. They're hard-coded essentially. So in that case, absolutely, it is far better than just a password. But on the other hand, in the spectrum of security, it's one of the, I would say it's one of the lower end.
Don't think of it as being locked down. So that, you're right, that applies to all OTP. Hard tokens also have, as you said, the expense and the logistical challenge we talked about before. Then there's soft tokens on your mobile device, which gets around the expense and the logistics problem, but it adds a new problem in addition to the OTP trouble, which is now, in addition to having your computer where you're logging in being owned, there's also the possibility that your phone is owned. And if your phone is owned, then you're still vulnerable. So there's another attack surface.
Yeah, Tim, I would say that the advantage of soft token one-time passwords over hard token has very little to do with security, and actually has a lot more to do with convenience. In other words, if you have a lot of applications, it would be a real pain in the neck to have to walk around with multiple hard tokens, which had been the case for a while back in the day. Soft tokens made it a lot more convenient because you could have a lot of applications handled by a single OTP app.
Right. And then from there, let's go to SMS OTP, which once again has the OTP problems, but also SMS now is vulnerable to its own set of attacks. If you get SIM swapped, then somebody can essentially, what I want to say, short circuit, do an end run on your SMS and get your OTP themselves. So that also has its own unique vulnerability.
Yeah, Tim, I think it's worth mentioning that I remember back in the day, and I'm talking now about the 2010 to 2015 time frame. I remember talking to a lot of customers about their journeys in multi-factor authentication, thinking, hey, we're doing a good thing. We're adding this extra step of having an SMS issued one-time password. And even back then, I was demonstrating ways to bypass that particular form of multi-factor authentication. It got to the point where even NIST themselves, the standards body, had to deprecate SMS as a recommended form of multi-factor authentication. It's just not secure enough, and there are just so many ways in which SMS is vulnerable. I don't think people realize that when an SMS is going across the wire, that thing is in the clear. And I think that a lot of European banks who initially used this form of authentication factor really found out the hard way, including ways in which you just said, Tim, which was the Android application especially, which did automatic redirects of SMS OTPs to the attacker.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this comes back to, if your phone is owned, then none of this is reliable. So that's OTP. So there's a variety of OTP methods. So then something that's more recent than this is the automated phone call. So how this works is when you want to log in, your phone rings, your mobile device or whatever your phone on file is rings, and you have to pick it up and you have to hit a key or a sequence in order to agree for that login to occur, and otherwise you're locked out from that login. So first problem with this is it's terribly inconvenient. I have one of these services and I'm on a phone call and I'm trying to log into something and I can't because I'm going to have to hang up the phone call that I'm on, right? And if I'm not willing to hang up that phone call, I have to decide not to log into that other service until I'm done with the call. Or you're in a room, you're in a meeting room, and you don't want your phone to ring. All these kinds of things occur. But in addition to that, you have the same problem. It's depending on the integrity of the phone.
Exactly right, Tim. And even if your phone does not have malware on it, SIM swapping is a real problem. That's something that I think everybody should investigate if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah. So I would say probably better than one-time password. I don't know if you agree with that, Jay, but still far from invulnerable.
It's only better than one-time password if the automated phone system itself is not giving you a one-time password with which you then have to type into the laptop. If it's a completely out-of-band system, then there is an advantage, yes.
Yeah. All right. Then there's the knowledge challenge. So this is the classic, you get asked a question, right? So you get asked a question that you have provided the answer to ahead of time, or you get asked more than one question, you've provided the answer to ahead of time. So in fact, it's multiple shared secrets in conjunction with each other.
Yes, all of which can be keylogged the same way that your password can be keylogged, right? In fact, the slide you threw up earlier about the problems with passwords, exact same problems with this.
Absolutely. So again, it will defeat the very simplest attacks. If someone managed to harvest my username and password and they're just selling it to somebody on the internet who has no idea who I am, it will defeat that attack. If you are using a very simple automated credential stuffing attack, it will defeat that attack. But if you get even a little bit more sophisticated than that, it doesn't work. And this reminds me, of course, of the story of Sarah Palin's Yahoo Mail. So Sarah Palin had created a Yahoo Mail account, which was her email account. And she had gone in very short time from being, an unknown mayor of a small town in Alaska to a national vice presidential candidate, and she was still doing email on her Yahoo Mail account, and someone took over her Yahoo Mail account using a knowledge challenge, because the two questions were, where did you go to high school, and what is the name of your pet? And both of those were easy to figure out, right? They were covered broadly in the media. And so there is a sketchability problem, right? And then on the opposite end, if you make the problems harder, there is a vast usability problem for the user, right? You know, I'm setting something up and it asks me, you know, what's my favorite fruit? And I don't know, and I shrug and I say grapes. And then, you know, a year later, I'm trying to get into this darn thing, and it says, what's your favorite fruit? And I don't know, I shrug and I say mango, right? And that kind of thing absolutely can happen. So these are, you know, those are some unique problems for the knowledge challenge as well. Now, next on the list, and there we go. Next is biometric. So biometric certainly could be a fingerprint, but it also could be other things. A picture of your face on your iPhone is a great example of a biometric. Or some biometric systems ask you to do something like type in a word or do something with the mouse and claim to be, you know, able to tell your unique, let's say, typing style or mousing style from somebody else's. Not sure how much that is true, but that's the claim. So thoughts on biometrics, Jay?
Sure, Tim. In fact, you know, I'm running a computer right now that uses my thumbprint to help me to log in. You know, I think biometrics are in a lot of places. The thing is, though, one thing that you may have noticed, anybody listening to this, is that most times biometrics are not used for a full authentication challenge. And why is that? Well, it's because your face, your voice, your thumbprint, fingerprint, none of those things are secrets. Those are things that may be unique to you, but they're not secrets. The way that, say, even a password is technically a secret. I mean, my grandfather was lifting fingerprints off of people back in the 1950s as a policeman. And, you know, those techniques are used by attackers just as easily. The fact of the matter is, what constitutes a biometric authentication in most systems is actually a very, very simplistic statistical representation of your iris, your face, your thumb. It's not the amount of secret entropy, if you want to use a technical term, within that is actually quite low. Therefore, biometrics are typically used as PIN replacements in order to be able to try to keep out the easy attack for, let's say, some, you know, you've left your phone on a desk somewhere, you want to keep out the obvious person. So therefore, it's going to be an extra level of challenge for them to be able to show their face or their thumbprint so that they can't get into the system. But you don't typically see full-blown biometrics used as an authentication method because they really just are not secure enough.
Fair enough. But they do help, again, with some scenarios you talked about, like that's for example, I lose my phone, right? My phone falls out of my pocket somewhere, and I don't want anyone in the world to be able to get into my phone. So biometrics. Yeah,
I would say it's really about convenience and usability more than security.
Yeah, sure. Then there's behavioral. So behavioral is there's some back-end expectation, some intelligence or heuristics built in the back end that's expecting certain things from you. And where those things don't occur, that usually gets flagged behavioral. That doesn't necessarily mean that you get locked out. Usually what it means is some kind of additional or some additional level of authentication is required. Or to put it another way, the behavioral sometimes is looking for certain markers that are considered to be indicative enough that it's really you, that perhaps we will forego an additional factor of authentication for this particular login when those markers occur. So for instance, I'm logging in from a place where I'm expected to be, like my office at work.
Yes, and unfortunately, especially with Android devices as an example, those things are fairly easily spoofed. What looks difficult to the average user is not as difficult to people who've been to a few Black Hat conferences and realize these things are fairly easy to spoof on several operating systems.
Yeah.
So therefore, behavioral and reputational type of characteristics are not, as it says on this slide, not typically used as an authentication mechanism. Where I've often seen them used is as a step-up mechanism. In other words, the computer system, the authentication system is saying, hey, I've measured an odd behavior here. I've measured an odd location that is contrary to what I'm expecting. So therefore, I should step up the level of multi-factor authentication that this user is, that I'm going to challenge them with, or perhaps even flag that as potential fraud, that then I'll use a different channel of communication to what I know is the real user. So it definitely has its benefits. It's another layer of security. It's a good thing, but again, it's not a full solution to a form of secure authentication.
So I'm just thinking of an experience I had last year before travel lockdowns. I was at the CA Browser Forum conference in Bratislava, and I had never been there before in my life. And my wife chatted me and said, I'm having trouble logging into our Netflix account. Can you tell me what the password is? And I didn't remember, so I thought I'd just log in and change the password and give her the new password. So I go and I try to log in, and of course instantly red alert, right? Because somebody from Slovakia was trying to log into my Netflix, and so then it sent me something in my email, and I had to confirm it was really me. And that's an example of that kind of step up, where it's automatic, it's in the background, you don't have to provision it, and that's, I think, an example of it working well, right? So it definitely has a place in this universe, but you can't view it as a surrogate for full authentication.
That's right, Tim. All of these systems do have a place because, not everything has enormous risk either. So sometimes lower levels of authentication are just fine as long as you match it to the risk.
Mm-hmm. Right, and these are part of your tools to do that as well. But all of them carry their weaknesses, their holes, their disadvantages, and certainly everything that we looked at in the previous 8 or so slides has weaknesses, right? And is defeatable, and certainly for a determined, sophisticated attacker, all of those things can be circumvented. And this is where we come to the concept of software-defined perimeter. So software-defined perimeter, STP, is part of a philosophy about how you give access and permissions to systems and data. And maybe let's define a few terms, right, Jay? So zero trust architecture, what does that mean?
Zero trust architecture is probably, it is a subset of Secure Access Service Edge, which we'll talk about in a moment, but I think that anybody looking at that right now should realize that there has been a long tradition within security architecture where there are typically enterprise networks and then there's the hostile internet. And the boundary between the two, the edge between the two, is typically defined by a firewall. And so therefore, anything behind that firewall on the enterprise network was typically trusted. In other words, any traffic going on, the security architect would say, well, you don't have to worry so much about that traffic because it's behind the firewall, and therefore, I'm going to inherently trust my printer, these laptops, this server over here, and all the other endpoints that are on that enterprise network.
Anything
any
in
traffic
in my NOC, yes.
Yeah. And anything then coming in from the hostile internet, well, I'm going to scrutinize that with my firewall, and we're all good. The problem is we realize that, first of all, we now have networks that are far more complex than that. We now are utilizing public clouds, hybrid clouds. We also realize from years and years of attackers compromising enterprise systems that compromised internal systems, including the most recent SolarWinds attack as an example.
Yeah.
mean that there are umpteen numbers of ways through either social engineering or other forms of attack, such as what happened with the SolarWinds customers. Malware can get in on the inside of that corporate network. And so therefore, traffic going on the internal enterprise network, you cannot trust it as much as you think. And Tim,
right.
we could probably spend the rest of this webinar just on this slide alone going through all the different internal attacks.
We have in the past, absolutely. And so zero trust, what does that mean? What do you do instead, Jay?
That's it, Tim. You're lining me up now for the punchline, which is, now that we know that there's too much trust inside of our enterprise networks, zero trust kind of means what it says, which is not only should you treat the public internet as hostile, but you should probably treat your internal enterprise network as hostile as well. And that doesn't mean boiling the ocean. It means to adopt a set of principles. And as you have on the slide, the principles is least privilege, meaning typically the problem you have on an enterprise network is that you've given the credentials for authentication within those systems too much privilege. Right. So what you want to do is minimize what the attacker could potentially do if they get on the inside, if they establish a beachhead on the inside of your trusted network.
So the holy grail on this, to the degree it's possible, is that every actor, if you will, every person, every server, every service, every system, every command, every API is only doing the bare minimum that it must be able to do to function correctly, and all other behaviors are disallowed, right? All other permissions are removed. And the closer you get to that ideal, and perhaps that ideal is achievable in its pure form, but the closer you get to that ideal, the more you remove the potential for an intruder to do harm, to move laterally through your network, to create, spawn other mechanisms of attack and all of the other things that a sophisticated attacker will do.
Yeah, Tim, and in fact, really, if you get to the heart of it, a large chunk of what that will require is actual real strong authentication between systems. So therefore, there used to be a lot of systems within enterprise networks that did not require strong authentication. And if you're going to employ strong authentication between systems that didn't used to have it, that requires digital identities, right? That's really at the heart of all of these concepts and all of these principles.
Yeah. And so once you're using zero trust architecture, now you can say that you have a software-defined perimeter. So instead of your perimeter being this single bright line firewall, as we all favored in the 1990s, rather your software, your rules, your governance, your permissions, your access permissions are themselves defining what the perimeter is, and the perimeter is unique to every situation, every device, every digital actor who's doing something inside of your network.
Tim, probably the most classic example of that is VPN, right? Virtual private network, where it was very, very commonplace, still even to this day, to issue a VPN credential to someone, let them authenticate into your corporate network from some remote location from a hostile public internet. And then once that person is authenticated to their VPN, they now have full privileges onto the network. We're finding that that's problematic, especially for VPN systems that are using just username and password as an authenticator or a weak form of multi-factor authentication. So therefore, software-defined perimeter is essentially a concept of VPN replacement, where asking yourself, what is the task that user is really doing within the corporate network? Rather than giving them full unfettered access within the network, let's lock down what that person can actually do to their least privileges. Exactly what you just said.
So to kind of give you some real simple examples we can all sympathize with, if I'm an HR employee, I don't need access to the source code. So I don't get it, right? Or vice versa. If I'm a developer, I don't need access to employees' individual information, right? Personal information, so I don't get that. And what happens is someone has looked at what would an individual, and again, it doesn't have to be a person, it could be a program. What would this need to be able to do, and you just let them do that.
Yeah, Tim,
and then, so what, go ahead.
No, it's just expanding on that. I have seen examples of enterprises where, especially smaller enterprises, where everybody was an admin.
Yeah.
Meaning, if an attacker compromised anybody, they essentially become, somebody who could take over the most, the most sensitive parts of the network and have unfettered access. These are long-time problems that we still see. And thankfully, these new principles are teaching people how to think about it a lot better.
And then SASE, which you've already alluded to, what's a pithy definition of SASE? Software Access Service Edge. What's the short definition of that, Jay?
Sure. It really is the evolution of next generation firewall, but adding the concept of Let's break the term into two: secure access and service edge. Secure access basically meaning authentication. It can be a lot of things. It can also include those behavioral rules and everything else. But from our standpoint on this webinar, it really is all about authentication, service access, to a service edge. And that service edge is a super highly generic term, meaning any network node, anything connected to your network should essentially be its own service edge by definition. And if you really come down to it, it comes down to how do you define a service edge? You define it with a digital identity in order to be able to enact the secure access for authentication. So essentially, secure access service edge means authentication of a node.
Right. And that node, just to skip to my little bubble comment here on the bottom, that is, in the real world of computers, that is PKI. Like, that is how it's done, period. So all of these things, if you're implementing Zero Trust, if you're doing SDP, if you're fundamentally a SASE shop, the only way that can actually be accomplished is through PKI, aka digital certificates.
Yeah, there are other forms of crypto key identifiers that are available to you. The problem with a lot of that is they are unmanaged. They don't have policies for expiry. They don't have a lot of the other forms of management. And that's exactly what PKI is giving you above just the simple public and private key.
Right. So I threw a bunch of slides in here, Jay, and we probably don't need to look at all of them, but I thought they'd be nice visual aids to explain. So why is it? So we say, okay, PKI, you said passwords, shared secrets are fundamentally vulnerable, and they also present these other sort of usability and user problems. And PKI gets around those problems both on the vulnerability side and on the usability problem side. So let's explain that in a little more detail, and I've got my standard how PKI works slides, and we can look at what we want to look at. But at a high level, why is it, how is it that PKI gets around these problems, Jay?
Sure, Tim. We spent the beginning of this webinar talking through the problems with passwords and the problems with multi-factor authentication on top of passwords. And again, to reiterate, the main problem with any of those authentication schemes is the fact that they are shared secrets. And the means with which an attacker can exploit vulnerabilities in either the endpoint or on the network, unfortunately, shared secrets are quite vulnerable. And so PKI is a very, very long-term technology. It's been around a long time, 30 plus years. It's very tried, very tested, and is in just about every form of interaction, secure interaction that you do without you even realizing it. That includes credit card interactions, all the way to using your password, right? So it's been around. But let's talk about the difference between a PKI secret and a shared secret, because this really comes down to it.
Yeah.
What happens if you take a secret, and that secret could essentially be, a long string of numbers like you see on the right-hand side. That long string of characters, if you were to break that in half, and you essentially keep one half for yourself, and you call that a private key, and you never share that with anyone ever, and then you hand out the other half to anybody that you want to interact with, that's called the public key, then all the different mechanisms of authentication and signing and ways to attest to yourself is then accomplished by using this combination of a public secret and a very, very well secured secret. So, for example,
Go ahead.
no, let's talk about just the authentication example as quickly as I can possibly give it. Let's say you're a server, Tim, and I'm the user logging into you. You possess my public key, I possess your public key, and then we both possess our own private keys. If you will then issue me a challenge when I knock on your door and say, hey, I want to log into you, you're going to issue a challenge to me which I can sign with my private key. I essentially encrypt a very tiny document with my private secret. You can then measure that and go, yeah, that guy, that's absolutely, I'm able to decrypt that because I possess the public key of that person. And then we can do that.
The only way that can be done mathematically is if you have the correct private key, and that private key is a secret, which means that either you are who you say you are, or that private key has somehow been appropriated. So, assuming that you secure your private keys correctly, then we can have a high degree of confidence in your identity.
And Tim, here is the biggest point, because we could get very deep into the PKI weeds, but I think the most important thing to remember here is you never, ever were exposed to my private key. I was never exposed to your private key. Our private keys were never sent across a network. Our private keys were very safely ensconced within our secure elements, whatever that happened to be. And so therefore, the attacker does not have those traditional forms of attack that they do with shared secrets.
Exactly. And so you take all of that, you wrap that in a certificate, which gives us some other advantages, which is a slide I passed over. And at the end of the day, what you wind up with is a system that is very robust from a security perspective, but also gets around all of these problems, I'll call them usability problems that we have with passwords, right? And this whole, I can't remember it and I'm frustrated and I'm generating a help desk ticket, or I've got an MFA that's, making my life difficult in the following way. All of those problems are removed because we can have a high degree of reliance that the PKI authentication is trustworthy.
Tim, a lot of people on this webinar listening might have heard of the old saying of, authentication can be accomplished by something you know, something you are, and something you possess. And right. We just ran through a lot of that, just by talking through the different forms of multi-factor authentication, biometrics, shared secret passwords, something etc. Really, I think what PKI certificates give you is another form of that, which is something you possess. And thankfully, part of what you possess is very, very safely ensconced within typically something like a hardware secure element. In other words, right. the level with which, the level of difficulty with which an attacker would have to go through to be able to compromise your private key, if you're storing it correctly, is vastly, vastly more difficult than it is for a typical shared secret.
Right, and so this certificate, just not to put too fine a point on it, this certificate is embedded on my laptop, on my mobile device, on my email client, or of course inside of my enterprise, it is sitting on every server or every virtual machine or every task, right?
Tim, let's talk about an example of just going into your enterprise office environment with your laptop, a mobile device. Wouldn't it be nice to not have to type in your, the Wi-Fi password, which might be posted with a sticky note or written on a piece of paper in the visitor room of your enterprise, right? What happens if you've been provisioned with one of these PKI certificates, and then the user experience is merely you just walk into the office and you are securely connected? No sticky notes, no difficulty in provisioning, no, and much, much less security risk. It takes us from the stone age of security with just username passwords and brings us to a better user experience in terms of authentication. I use that Wi-Fi example.
It doesn't matter who sits in the parking lot with their laptop, they're never getting it, right?
Precisely, Tim, precisely. And the thing is, I use that as an example because it's just so intuitive. Like, who hasn't walked into their office and needed to get the Wi-Fi? That's just fundamental. Yeah. And it's absolutely true for every form of authentication, especially as we move towards software-defined perimeter, as we move towards zero trust network architecture, and as we move towards SASE. Those forms of authentication will be used more and more and more, not even just by you as a user, but also by other nodes within your enterprise network as well.
Right, right. And that's a lot of the concept of when you get into an idea like SASE is we're not just talking about the humans, right? Although the humans are important, and we talk about the humans and helping them avoid passwords, but the same principles apply to all of my systems and all of my infrastructure and everything. I ultimately everything digital that my enterprise does.
So Tim, with what you just said, you can imagine that there is going to be a proliferation of digital identities, hence the need for management of those identities, which is something that PKI has been doing for 30 plus years.
Right, yeah, and that's the other advantage, is all of that can be handled, right? We've got the great legacy of certificates, and I kind of skipped over the slides on certificates, but certificates are really good because what they do is they take these keys, which are the foundational element of all of this, and they give you some tools you can use. You can identify which key it is, who it's assigned to. You can put an expiration on it. You can revoke it. You can determine other qualities, governance qualities that you require for your keys, and then you can know whether or not they're meeting those criteria. You can monitor these things. All of that becomes possible once you put these certificate wrappers on it, and then once you give yourself some tools to help see them, monitor them, maintain them, renew them, etc., manage them, etc.
Yeah, right on, Tim.
All right. So, and then I think we probably covered everything on this slide, right? But what the advantages? So, private key can't be social engineered. It is not ever transmitted across the internet, so it can't be stolen in transit. It can't be keylogged, right? It can't be taken from your servers. It can't be brute force. It can't be guessed. It can't be it can't be credential stuffed, right? And so all of those problems go away because private keys just are not subject to that.
Yeah, Tim, I don't want to sit here and claim that any form of security is perfection. Right. There are issues with everything, but I think the important point to be made here is the level of security that you're achieving by using a client certificate, PKI-based client certificate, compared to other forms of authentication, the gap is miles and miles, meaning the difficulty that you're giving to the attacker when you are utilizing a strong form of authentication, such as a PKI certificate, it's not in the same league.
Right. Right. And then, this just applies again, think about all the places users come in. So you mentioned VPNs, Wi-Fi, you mentioned single sign-on, right, is a big one. Windows Hello, etc., right? There are others. And in all these cases, PKI is usable in all those scenarios. So let me do a quick plug. Jason and I talk a lot on our podcast. We mentioned this at the beginning. Root Causes, it's available in wherever you listen to podcasts. So just search for Root Causes PKI or go to the Sectigo website, sectigo.com, and you can listen to us. And we talk about all kinds of things having to do with certificates, PKI, and related encryption and related security matters. With that, I think we've got 14 minutes to go. Let's try to take some questions. Christian, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Tim, we did receive a few questions. So first up, how does PKI fit in with single sign-on?
Right. So single sign-on, I just mentioned that. So Jay, at a high level, single sign-on is, I go to a system where I have a single login, right? Presumably that might be a password or password plus an MFA. And then from there, that system in the background will log me into various things. So I've got different cloud services, and I've got different services inside my enterprise. I have to go to my desktop. I have to log in exactly once, and once I've logged in exactly once from my from my laptop, then all these services are available to me. So in that kind of scenario, Jay, and that's probably a vendor like Okta or Ping or one of those guys. In that kind of scenario, where does PKI fit in?
Sure, Tim. So there are a lot of systems out there. Let's talk about something like Office 365, where you might be going between a lot of different applications and perhaps even to your CRM application, perhaps something like Salesforce, and also something like perhaps ServiceNow, right? You're using a lot of applications within a day. If you have a client certificate that is used on your, whatever system that it is that you're using, with the workstation that you're using to authenticate into those systems, then there's a number of ways to handle single sign-on. One way that it could possibly be done is through one of those systems. You could choose them to be the federation system with which you have to log in. In other words, you could log into Office 365 or some of those other cloud systems, and regardless of which one you're logging into, essentially you've then logged into the others as you move between them, because your authentication session is essentially shared. So there's, it's quite generic. There's a lot of different ways to set up a federated authentication, but with respect to how PKI fits in, it really has a lot to do with the fact that you're no longer having to remember passwords for all these different systems. You don't have multiple forms of multi-factor authentication. All you have is that provisioned certificate, and the user experience of flowing between each of these applications to the user is very, very natural. You're not being challenged all the time.
Great. Okay. Cool. Kristen, next.
Next up, since passwords have all these problems, how come they're used so often?
Sure. Right. We all have them, right? And they're awful, and they're a miserable experience, and they're also on the spectrum of security, they're pretty poor. Yet we all have them. Everybody can laugh and think about these experiences that we're having. So, what gives, Jay? Why is that?
They're cheap. They're easy to implement, and unfortunately, security first is. We live in an age, Tim. It's 2021, and security first is still not a mantra for all security development. That's just a simple fact.
Yeah, I think it's the world is still catching up, right? I think that They were around first. When there was nothing else, there was, username, password. They're basic and fundamental, and everybody knows what they are. And there's a lot of legacy stuff that's been around for a long, long time, and there's a long tail of users who are not computer science experts who understand this, and all of those are factors that are resistant to change. Right?
There's technical debt, and then there's greenfield applications which should know better, right? You either come into one or the other. Technical debt can almost be forgiven because everybody has older applications that they're still using, which might be from a different era. But really, if you're building a net new application in today's world, especially with the advent of the cloud, etc., more modern forms of authentication utilizing PKI are readily available to you.
Yeah, cool. What else, Kristen?
So that's a good segue into our next question. So what about password managers? Do they solve these problems?
Sure. Okay. So, I can't remember my damn passwords, and they're guessable, so I'm going to get these crazy strings that make no sense, and I'm going to stick them all in a password management application or service, and I'm going to use that instead. What do you think of that, Jay?
Sure. If you're, let me speak from the attacker's point of view. What do they care? All the problems about passwords we talked about earlier still apply. The only thing a password manager is causing a heartache for an attacker is the fact that you might not be using a sticky note anymore. You might not be putting, creating a passwords.txt file, putting all your passwords. That's a good thing for security, but all the other problems that you pointed out earlier, Tim, still apply.
And I'm probably not reusing passwords, so that helps. So yeah, it's better than not doing it, but a lot of the problems we discussed with passwords are still there, right? If I'm being keylogged, I'm being keylogged. Who cares, right? So that's still a weakness, and that's still a challenge. Okay, what else, Kristen?
Right, that makes sense. So what kinds of certificates would be appropriate for user authentication?
Okay, yeah, all right, fine. We say they're gonna, you're gonna have this on your laptop, you're gonna have it on your phone. What is that, Jay? What kind of certificate are we using?
I guess at the most generic level, we are talking about an X509 standard TLS certificate. And so that's different. That is, kind of different in the way that it's formed and its purpose than what we might call an SSL certificate that you might be familiar with publicly trusted websites and domains. These are, same kind of X509 certificate, but they're meant very specifically for authentication. And basically, these are private keys wrapped within a certificate that still have expiry dates and policies written on them, and they're managed by a PKI. But there's many kinds of certificates that can be used for authentication. SMIME certificates can actually be used for authentication into email systems. We also have SSH keys that can be wrapped into certificates for remote access authentication for cloud access. There's actually many forms of certificates. Certificates that are meant very specifically for devices, IoT certificates, or mobile device certificates for that Wi-Fi access point type of scenario. Typically, the technical differences between those types of certificates are fairly subtle, because every one of these certificates has a different way that they're formed and the way that they're provisioned. But essentially, they all do just about the same thing. And from a user standpoint, they don't really have to know too much about the differences between them.
Cool. I think we still have a decent number of questions, so let's try to make sure we get to as many of them as we can. Kristen, what do we have next?
Absolutely. So does it mean the person is restricted to access the application or service from a particular client? What happens when a person wants to access the application or service from another client?
okay, so I've got a certificate on my laptop, and for some reason I don't have my laptop. I forget my charger, the battery's dead, and I want to borrow a computer and log on. Does that mean I can't?
Right. So typically, Tim, in that scenario, what would often happen is what the PKI system will often afford you is the ability to re-provision you. So there's obviously a chicken and egg problem that has to be solved, which is, from your new system, how do you actually then authenticate yourself into the registration system so that then you can provision a new certificate to your new endpoint? That's what a PKI affords you, and that's one of the big advantages to say the difference between just a simple crypto key authenticator, which doesn't know much about its policies, doesn't really have a way to just as easily be provisioned. PKI has that kind of registration process to re-register and re-provision a new system in a fairly, easy way for the user.
And let me add, you're also not limited to one client, right? There's no reason why you can't have, several mobile devices, one or more laptop, something else. If there's something else, and they might all be allowing you access to the same systems, and they all might be mapped back to your identity and your permissions. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one correspondence at all.
Yeah, Tim, I think the answer to this question is, unfortunately, it depends on the use case, and it depends on the level of risk that you're trying to mitigate.
Okay. What's next, Kristen?
Okay, next we have, from your presentation, ZTA sounds solid and secure. Just how expensive is this in SASE, and how long would it take to convert old authentication systems to this one?
Wow, that's a big one. We're going to have to do a short version of the answer of that, Jay. So, I figure I like it. I like ZTA. I want to do it. What am I looking at?
Well, thankfully, Tim, I think there is a portion of this which is a short answer, which is there are certain kinds of systems, such as HR systems, finance systems, that where people used to use those traditional forms of network authentication, VPN, where because of the advent of the cloud, you're then able to go through and do your job, but you don't have to do it necessarily through a VPN. Additionally, there are other service providers out there who provide, cloud access brokers, people who are really doing the policy part of the secure access part of SASE. There are other vendors that are part of that. And if you couple that with even other vendors who are doing the privileged access piece to it, as a customer within the SASE world, you're not typically going to just one vendor. Typically, depending on what it is you're trying to do, you can cobble together the pieces that you need in order for your user to then much more securely access exactly what they need as part of their day job, and not just do the traditional VPN route. That's unfortunately, Tim, we could spend a whole webinar just on that one.
We could, and the last point I'll add is this also doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, right? Like I think in the real world, how this is typically done is in stages. We pick certain aspects of our business and we implement zero trust there, and then we expand, right? Plan and expand, and we probably start with the things either where the implementation is the most straightforward and reliable and trustworthy, or where the stakes are highest, right? So again, maybe you say, look, we're going to secure our source code, we're going to secure our customer PII, right? Those are going to be the things we do first. And then from there, we're going to expand other aspects of our business. Time for probably one more quick question, Kristen.
Okay, last question. Can you describe the Windows logon experience for a PKI certificate-based logon? What is it like when I log on to my corporate laptop first thing in the morning?
So you just open it up, right, Jay?
Yeah, you might be issued with a PIN, and that's right. About it. So in other words, you might have to do your biometric with a thumb or just show your face, and the certificate does the rest.
Right, but that's just to make sure it's you who is accessing the laptop. And then from there, the laptop does the access to everything else automatically by itself. You're not asked for anything. You don't see anything, and it's instant.
That's perfect. Well, that concludes our questions for today. Thank you for your time, Tim. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
We're done on time. I love it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye.